I could still faintly hear the telephone exploding regularly in the empty house like an alarm clock in a bucket. This is good stuff. Though it was the most important nonfiction work of its time, Witness, if invented, would have made a splendid novel. Plot lines like the Ford Roadster and the pumpkin hiding place would have done credit to a Raymond Chandler, or for that matter, Buckley the novelist. Its twists and turns, suspenseful action, and even more suspenseful psychological anguish make for a crackling good yarn. Apart from all the dramatics, it furnishes one of our finest philosophical travelogues, as the author comes painfully to terms with the evil of his original beliefs. And without losing its intrigue, it delivered a legal brief that demolished the charade of lies with which Alger Hiss and his frenzied defenders tried to deny the plain facts of treason. Yeah, Witness is that rarity of the writer's craft that on many levels seizes its readers by both lapels and the necktie at the same time. But, of course, it's as a manifesto of freedom and anti-communism that we celebrate it and gather tonight to discuss its continuing relevance. This room, and I know rooms worldwide, are filled with people in whom this book produced epiphany. My good friend, the late Robert Novak, described the impact of reading as a 22-year-old second lieutenant in Korea. He said, "Without exaggeration, it changed my life." Most books with followings as passionate as this one are treatises of hope, uplifting works that inspire their readers with can-do exhortations and images of better tomorrows. Americans in particular have to this point been a forward-facing, optimistic people who, as George Will sometimes reminds us, have always located their golden age in the future, not the past. But Witness, we all know, is a profoundly pessimistic statement. My friend Herb London taught me that an optimist is someone who says, "This is the best of all possible worlds." And the pessimist is he who responds, "You're right." Chambers, in his introductory letter to his children, does claim this is also a book of hope, but this was a one-line departure from a foreword otherwise dominated by lines like, "It is a terrible book. It is terrible in what it tells about men. It is more terrible in what it tells about the world in which you live." Whittaker Chambers' courage and despair both were magnified by his staunch conviction, we all know, that he had switched from the winning to the losing side. And as desolate as he was in believing that the West would succumb to the communists, he surrendered even more forlornly to the conclusion that Western man no longer had within him the stuff of freedom. His witness to the facts of treason and totalitarianism was in some ways secondary. He wrote of the two forms of witness that I had to bear, the second being that of, quote, "the human witness." Chambers accepted the assignment of martyrdom, standing alone and friendless for truths no longer generally embraced by those around him. Believing as he did, what posture but deep pessimism would make any sense? Now, the voice of pessimism is loud again in the land. Chambers' lamentation about, quote, "this sick society that we call Western civilization," is echoed today, maybe more desperate and shrill, especially in the wake of the recent election. Here's a brief sampling from the last few weeks. Ron Paul opined, "We're far gone, we're over the cliff." The estimable Mr. Limbaugh announced, "We're doomed." One Alan Karuba suggested, quote, "the 2012 election was a vote to commit national suicide." And in the most florid of the genre that I found in a quick scan, one can read this: "The traditional American virtues of liberty, hard work, free enterprise, private initiative, and aspirations to moral greatness no longer inspire or animate a majority of the electorate. Society is permeated with sloth, greed, envy, and materialistic excess. It has lost its moorings and its moral foundations. The old America is gone. And sad for the world, it is not coming back. America is not what it was and will never be again. Well, this last example was written by a rabbi from New York, which struck me as entirely fitting. The eponymous Old Testament prophet himself could not have produced a more gloomy Jeremiah. Now, it's a frequent and reasonable conjecture that a mortally dangerous, militaristic, and hegemonic threat like the Soviet Union would actually be preferable to the dry rot of internal decay. Given a choice, Chambers himself might have seen taking on communism as less hopeless than reversing cultural decline. In that view, we have met the enemy and it is us, is a more dispiriting diagnosis than the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. The internal menace may well be a tougher adversary. It's certainly less susceptible to direct public action. We could catch spies, rearm the nation, embark on missile defense, and support freedom and freedom fighters by straightforward policy decisions and the will of leadership. It'll be far more difficult to rebuild national character if, in fact, it is eroded too much. Of course, the worry that the character essential to liberty would prove ephemeral indeed would be undone by its own material success is as old as the Republic itself. Hence Franklin's famous retort when asked what kind of government he and his colleagues had delivered. A republic, madam, if you can keep it. The death a month ago, after 104 incredibly productive years, of Dr. Jacques Barzun sent me back to his great work From Dawn to Decadence. There he taught, when people accept futility and the absurd as normal, the culture is decadent. The term is not a slur, it is a technical label. By Barzun's definition, it is tempting to look around us and decide that this label fits our times all too neatly. And yet the forces most irresistible in the modern world continue to lean in favor of individual freedom and against dictatorship, regimentation, and top-down control. Most obviously, each new breakthrough in technology makes individual empowerment and the evasion of state control more, not less likely. George Gilder foresaw this a quarter century ago. He wrote, rather than pushing decisions up through the hierarchy, the power of micro-technology pulls them remorselessly down to the individual. It applies not only to business organizations, but to the very power of the state as well. At the outset of Modern Times, the book that struck me and formed my thinking much as Witness did Bob Novak's, Paul Johnson wrote, "The scientific genius impinges on humanity for good or ill, far more than any statesman or warlord. The explosion of scientific knowledge now occurring in places like this great university and at the one I soon will serve, for all its dangers, seems more likely to confound rather than enable the would-be tyrants of our day." Analysts of the recent election are pondering how, in defiance of computer models and most deterministic readings of political history, a candidate opposing such an objectively failed presidency could have lost. On top of a wretched national condition, one even worse than the most watched official figures indicate, the losing candidate was rated more highly on both the supposedly decisive economic issues and on leadership, normally the personal quality most valued by voters. The candidate's own explanation linked back to what many people, me included, believed to be the critical moment of the whole dreary campaign. In one of those imaginary private occasions that no longer exist for people in public life, Governor Romney memorably discussed the 47% of Americans who, he said, are dependent on government and therefore would never vote for him. In his post-mortem after the election, he reportedly extended this theme, saying that too many people had allowed their votes to be bought with promises of someone else's money. I think he was right about the origin of his problem, but wrong about its essence. Without doubt, we have a significant number of Americans for whom dependence and something for nothing have become a way of life. We've known for at least a half century that government policies were fostering such attitudes. And yes, some number of citizens surely did vote their pocketbooks in this self-interested sense. But they were far from 47% in number and would have voted for the incumbent president under any circumstances. I believe that the self-inflicted blow of Mr. Romney's statement came among Americans who find themselves in receipt of some form of government transfer, but reject or even despise the notion that they are permanent parasites for doing so. Think of people on Social Security earned through a lifetime of honest toil, of men thrown out of work by a reeling, mismanaged economy desperately trying to find new employment while on unemployment insurance, of young families, including active duty military personnel, working hard but still accepting food stamps, which for the moment they legitimately need to provide adequately for their families. I have met countless such people. They are among my employers, and I have made it a big part of my job to seek them out and know them. My take as a practitioner is that millions of Americans thought they heard Mr. Romney label them as parasites on society and said not, yes, and I deserve every penny, but hell no, that's not me. Whatever he intended, I think the candidate deeply offended countless citizens whose self-image and ambition does not accept or admit to lassitude or uselessness or ongoing reliance on the charity of others. The blunder was never corrected and in fact was exacerbated by a staggering tone deafness to the language and fears of the average American. A chronic disease of the Republican Party is the insistence on speaking in abstractions, or worse yet, in language that offers no clue and no argument that the principles of liberty are far better for people at the bottom than the statist alternatives. And in language that entirely overlooks and omits the most powerful appeal possible. We believe in you and your ability to decide for yourself, and they don't. Like most diseases, this one is totally preventable. Exactly the same ideas and policies can be framed in terms of their superior outcomes for and greater confidence in the broad mass of the American people. The incomparable Winston Churchill, in a time of far greater danger and desperation than anything the U.S. faces today, infused his every utterance with unshakable affirmations of the character and capacity of his fellow citizens. Many believe that his trust, which detractors saw as mere bluster or wishfulness, was not only vindicated, but was to an extent transformative. Isaiah Berlin wrote of Churchill's countrymen, in the end, they approached his ideal and began to see themselves as he saw them. He transformed cowards into brave men and so fulfilled the purpose of shining armor.